My friend claims she can see ghosts. I've known Ava since the 5th grade. She's my oldest and closest friend. She's always claimed to be a psychic medium, able to see and talk to ghosts. Everywhere we went, she would say she saw them. Sometimes they were just shadows, sometimes just a presence, and sometimes full-blown apparitions. One I remember most was a ghost named Jim, or something like that. An old man she used to see in her closet. He wasn't malevolent or anything, but to me, that was creepy as hell. Ava, however, was always unfazed. As a kid, I believed her. But as I got older, I grew out of it, assuming she did too. After moving to another state, we lost touch for a few years. Then one summer I went back to visit, and we picked up right where we left off. We were sitting in her living room, watching TV and catching up, when I jokingly asked, "So, any ghosts around?" She casually replied, "Yeah, a couple, but the one standing out the most is an old lady outside your mom's bedroom." I laughed it off. In my mind, I was thinking, yeah, right, I'm a firm believer in science, psychology, and logic. I also know how powerful the human brain is. It plays tricks, projects fears, and creates illusions. I've always listened to people's paranormal stories with polite skepticism, but never took them seriously. Still, I humored her. I asked for details. "She's older, from Texas," Ava said. "Might be related to you and your mom. She's Native American." That's when I paused, because that brief description fit my Nana, but I brushed it off as coincidence. We were in Texas after all. Everyone has a dead grandmother, and Ava already knew my mom was part Native. But then I started testing her. I asked for specific details. My Nana's husband's name, how long I knew her before she passed, what gifts she gave me as a baby, which of her children were still alive. She got them all right. The final straw? I pointed at a portrait on the wall with my Nana's kids in it and asked, which one of these girls was the troublemaker? The party goer who always got into trouble? Ava pointed straight at her. At this point, I was properly spooked, but still in denial. I'd known Ava for years. Was there any chance she had stumbled across an old photo album? Overheard a conversation between me and my mom? Maybe I had told her these things myself and just forgot? We had been friends for 8 years. I had to have forgotten a few conversations, right? Then she mentioned another ghost. "A man," she said. "He wants to communicate." I asked a series of questions. His age, when he died, when he passed, what he did when he was alive. Pushing aside my unease, I treated it like a game. Either she was lying and deeply committed to the act, or we were actually talking to a ghost. At one point, I jokingly asked, "What's his type? Is he single?" We laughed, and after a while, we both got quiet, messing around on our phones. Then it happened. I suddenly felt an inexplicable chill on the right side of my neck. I ignored it, assuming it was a breeze or just my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't enough to make me react. I didn't even look up from my phone. But it felt different from a normal chill. Concentrated, like something icy was pressing against my skin. A few seconds later, Ava looked up at me and said, verbatim, "I just got an image of him touching your neck." She mimicked the motion, placing her hand exactly where I had felt it. Same side, same spot, just beneath my jaw. My heart dropped. The sheer coincidence of the placement, the action, and everything leading up to it, I was freaked the hell out. I know my experience isn't as extreme or terrifying as other ghost stories, but it was enough to shake me. It made me question what I thought I knew. I'm still skeptical. I still believe most things can be explained by psychology or tricks of the mind, but I take people's experiences a little more seriously now. A lot of self-proclaimed psychics and mediums are in it for attention or money, but Ava gets nothing from this. In fact, she's annoyed by it. She's not trying to creep people out at campfires. She's not looking for internet fame. And she's not scamming people into palm readings. It's just something she lives with. And honestly, if she really does see ghosts, that sounds like a terrible thing to live with. Saw a woman while camping. Last weekend, my wife and I took our 2 sons and my oldest son's girlfriend on a camping trip deep in the woods. We planned to stay for the full weekend, and everything was going great until our last night there. That night, I woke up with an odd feeling, an urge to check our surroundings. Something just felt off. When I looked around, I noticed my sons weren't in their tents. I got up and started walking, calling their names, and found them already on a trail ahead. They both said they had felt the same strange urge to step outside. My wife and my son's girlfriend were still asleep in their tents, so the 3 of us, my sons and I, kept walking. The water was about half a mile ahead, and since we were all awake, we figured we'd go check it out. As we got closer, we started hearing something, faint, almost like whispering. My sons heard it too, and then we saw her. A young woman, maybe in her late teens or early 20s, sitting on the ground near the water. She was filthy, her clothes tattered, and she was crying softly. I told my sons to stay back while I approached. I asked if she was okay, but when she looked up at me, she whispered something in a language I didn't understand. And then, she was gone. It was like I had blinked, and she had vanished. My sons saw it too. We stood there, stunned, unable to explain what we had just witnessed. I consider myself a skeptic, but there was no logical way to explain what had happened. We left early the next morning. There were no signs of anyone else in the area. No missing persons reports, no campsites nearby. Nothing. That's when things got weird at home. Since we got back, I've been having vivid dreams of that girl. 2 nights after returning, our house felt freezing, even though the thermostat was set to 75. Everyone in the house felt it. Our dog, usually friendly and relaxed, became jumpy and anxious. At first, I brushed it off. I didn't even consider the possibility that this could be something paranormal. Then, a few nights later, my wife and I started hearing footsteps in the hallway. At first, we assumed it was one of the kids getting up during the night. But when the footsteps didn't stop and seemed to be pacing up and down the hallway, I got up to check. No one was there. The footsteps didn't return for a few days, but by the end of the week, they started again. Then, on Saturday night, my son's girlfriend woke up screaming. She said she had seen a young girl standing by my son's bedside just staring at him. Within seconds, the figure vanished. Her description matched exactly what we had seen at the campsite. Since then, I've been researching the area where we camped, trying to find any history, urban legends, missing persons, anything that could explain what we saw. But I've found nothing. Now I'm here hoping someone might have some insight. Advice? Ghosts of the ER. I work in a hospital, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that ghosts are everywhere, but no one talks about them. People are afraid of being labeled crazy. Well, I'm here to talk about them. Story 1. The little girl in room 17. I was working a night shift in the emergency department as a resident. It was a quiet night. By 2 a.m., we had cleared most of the patients, and the night crew was just sitting around chatting. There were 8 of us. My attending, the charge nurse, the secretary, the radiology tech, and 3 nurses. One of the nurses had what she called a 6th sense. She often talked about a little girl who would run out of room 17 and dart into the med room between rooms 17 and 18. For context, our ED was set up like a fishbowl, a large square with us sitting in the middle, surrounded by patient rooms. Each room had one door that opened into the fishbowl, so we could see all of them, and they could see us. That night, it was about 3 or 3:30 a.m. and we were all joking around, dismissing the ghost stories. Some of us, myself included, openly mocked the idea of a ghost girl running between rooms. Someone even joked, if she's gonna be here, she might as well help out. Pass out meds or clean some bedpans. We all laughed. Then the lights flickered. At first, we thought it was Jimmy who was standing near the switch, but he swore up and down he hadn't touched it. Someone made another snarky comment about the ghost, and that's when we heard it. A loud crash from behind us, inside room 18. We all froze. Then, cautiously, we turned around. There were no patients in that part of the ED. No staff, no one. Just us, sitting in the fishbowl. Slowly, we made our way to room 18. Inside, we found the clock. A large 18-20-inch plastic wall clock that had been hanging high up on the east wall. It was now shattered on the floor, against the west wall. Now, for reference, the ED bed was in the center of the room. The clock had been nailed securely to the east wall, far out of reach. Logically, if it had just fallen, it should have landed right below the east wall. But instead, it was on the opposite side of the room, across the bed, against the west wall. Not a single piece was near the east wall where it should have fallen. It was as if something had ripped it off the wall and thrown it across the room. We stood there, staring at the wreckage, trying to make sense of it. The charge nurse insisted the nail was probably just loose, that it was a coincidence. But as we all examined the room, the same realization hit us. That clock had been thrown, and most of us agreed, if anything was responsible, it was the little girl. That was the night I became a lot less of a skeptic. Thanks for reading. Delivering pizza. Years ago, I worked as a delivery driver for a major pizza chain in a mid-sized town in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. One night, we got an order for a couple of pizzas going to a neighborhood I was familiar with, but a house I had never delivered to before. The teenage girl who took the order said the man on the phone sounded weird, out of breath, almost strained. She even thought he might have been saying something inappropriate, so we agreed that no female drivers would take the delivery. Other than that, it seemed like a normal order. I pulled the pizzas from the oven, packed them in my bag, and headed out. When I arrived, the house was completely dark. No porch light, no sign of movement inside. But that wasn't unusual. People rarely turn their lights on for delivery. And yes, that's a dig at those of you who don't. The house itself was an unassuming little bungalow, its front yard fenced in and badly overgrown. Something about the place made me uneasy. I stepped up to the door, opened the glass screen, and that's when I heard it. A muffled, angry voice. "Why do you do this to me?" I couldn't make out the rest, but the voice was male, low and seething. Then, silence. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I called out, "Pizza!" and immediately I heard a cabinet slam shut from inside. Then, silence again. Something felt off. I backed away, went to my car, and called the number on the ticket. The phone rang and rang. No answer. At this point, I figured maybe they had written down the wrong address. Still, I decided to check the back door. When I got there, my stomach dropped. The back door was boarded up. A wave of dread hit me. Something inside me screamed, "You're not supposed to be here." And then, clear as day, I heard a voice. "Get out." I turned and power walked back to my car, heart pounding. Just as I was getting in, a woman walking down the street stopped me. "What are you doing?" she asked, eyeing me suspiciously. I let out a nervous laugh and gestured toward my car, the delivery sign on top still glowing. "Trying to deliver a pizza to this house." Her expression immediately changed. "Hun, "Ain't nobody lived in that house," she said. "Ain't nobody lived there since the murder-suicide." I froze. Okay, maybe the customer had just written the wrong address. But then I looked at the ticket again. No full name, just initials. JJD. I asked her, "Do you know anyone around here with those initials?" The woman visibly paled. She nearly fainted. "That's him!" she gasped. "That's the man who killed his wife." I told her I had heard someone yelling inside when I pulled up. She shook her head, looking spooked. He was always yelling at her. Cops came out here more than once. She went on to say that the neighbors had even petitioned to have the house torn down, but it was still tied up in probate. I didn't stick around much longer. This isn't the first time I've heard of spirits interacting with technology, and I guess it won't be the last. Third wheel. A few years ago, my friend and I were traveling through a rural part of China. It was late when we finally arrived at our hotel, a modest, aging building tucked into the quiet outskirts of a small town. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a tired demeanor, checked us in without much small talk. Our room was on the 3rd floor. The hallway was dimly lit, the walls lined with faded floral wallpaper, and the air smelled slightly musty, as if the carpets hadn't been aired out in years. The whole place had an eerie stillness to it, but we were exhausted from the long journey and didn't think much of it. After dropping off our bags, we decided to head out to find dinner. The streets were nearly empty by the time we returned, just the occasional cyclist passing under the flickering streetlights. As we stepped back into the hotel and made our way up the creaky staircase to our room, my friend hesitated. "What is it?" I asked. He frowned, looking over his shoulder. "Nothing. I just thought I heard footsteps behind us." I glanced back down the empty corridor. There was no one. Shrugging, we continued to our room and locked the door behind us. Not long after settling in, the phone rang. It was the receptionist. "Sorry, sir," she said in a firm but polite voice. "Only 2 persons allowed in the room. You must pay more if it's 3 packs." I glanced at my friend, confused. "There's only 2 of us," I replied. "No one else." The line went quiet for a moment. Then she spoke again, this time with an odd tension in her voice. "But I saw 3 of you enter." A chill ran down my spine. I forced a laugh, thinking maybe she had mistaken someone else in the hallway for being with us. "You must have been mistaken," I said. "If you don't believe me, come up and check." Silence. Then, in a much softer voice, she murmured, I was mistaken. Apologies." She hung up before I could say anything else. I turned to my friend. He looked uneasy but said nothing. I decided not to push it. Maybe she had been confused. Maybe she hadn't. Either way, I just wanted to sleep. That night I slept soundly, but my friend did not. When I woke up the next morning, he was already up, pacing by the window. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes. Before I could even say good morning, he spoke. "We need to check out." His voice was low and urgent. I sat up, rubbing my eyes. "What? Why?" I don't want to stay here another night," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. I didn't argue. Something was clearly bothering him. We packed quickly and went downstairs to check out. The receptionist barely looked at us as she handed us our bill, her previous sharpness replaced by an oddly subdued demeanor. It wasn't until we were outside, walking toward the train station, that my friend finally told me everything. "The whole night," he said, his voice tight, "I kept dreaming of a woman." I frowned. "What woman?" "She was sitting in the chair by the desk," he said, glancing at me, his expression grim. "Or sometimes she was at the edge of my bed, just staring at me. I'd wake up and everything would be normal. But the moment I fell back asleep, she'd be there again." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Then he hesitated, took a deep breath and said, "And before we got to the hotel, when we were walking back from dinner, I swear I felt someone behind us. I kept hearing footsteps, but every time I turned around, there was no one. We left that town and never looked back. To this day, I don't know if my friend's dreams were just dreams. I don't know if the receptionist really saw a third person enter our room, but I do know this. When we walked up to that room that night, something followed us in. My great-grandmother. When I was around 4 years old, I had an imaginary friend named Daisy. She was a little girl, about my age, maybe 3 or 5. I would spend hours talking to her, playing pretend, and telling my mom all about the adventures we had together. My mom never thought much of it. Like many kids, I had a vivid imagination, and imaginary friends weren't unusual. But there was one thing that stood out. Every now and then, she would overhear me saying the name Daisy. Daisy was also the name of her grandmother. Still, she brushed it off as a coincidence. After all, I was too young to know much about my family history, and I certainly had never met my great-grandmother. Years passed, and I eventually forgot about Daisy. Fast forward to adulthood. One day, my aunt told me about a website called Ancestry, where you could look up your family tree and trace your lineage. Curious, I decided to check it out. I scrolled through names, recognizing some and discovering others for the first time. Then I saw it. Daisy Lee H. The name struck me like lightning. It felt so familiar, but I couldn't place why. And then, all at once, I realized. Daisy had been the name of my imaginary friend. A strange feeling settled over me as I clicked on her profile. There were several pictures, most of them from her adulthood, but one photo stood out. It was a picture of her as a little girl. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Something about the image felt off. Not in a bad way, but in an eerie, impossible way. I knew this face. The memories came rushing back. The vague but persistent image of my childhood friend, Daisy. The way she looked. The way she smiled. The same little girl from my childhood imagination was staring back at me from this old photograph. I sat there in shock, unable to look away. My hands trembled as I texted my mom. "Mom, do you remember my imaginary friend, Daisy?" She responded almost immediately. "Yeah, why?" I sent her the picture. She freaked out. We talked about it for hours, going over the details, piecing together what it could mean. I had never heard stories about my great-grandmother as a child. I had never seen her photo before. There was no logical explanation for why my imaginary friend, who had been so vivid, so real to me, matched her perfectly. Unlike most ghost stories, this one doesn't feel scary or unsettling. If anything, it feels comforting. I believe my great-grandmother was watching over me when I was a child, maybe as a guardian angel, maybe just as a loving spirit keeping me company. Either way, I don't think Daisy was ever imaginary. I think she was always there. He saved my life. In 2022, my grandfather passed away, and it shocked me, to say the least. He died the day before his birthday, April 5th. I had always believed in the afterlife, but I never put much stock in ghosts or paranormal activity, at least not until 2023. His death hit me harder than I expected. In late 2022, I was still struggling to cope. Then, on Halloween of that year, my ex cheated on me in front of everyone, including my grandma, at a skating rink. That was the breaking point. Something inside me just shattered. I don't know why it took me so long to truly consider it, but in early 2023, I made a public post on Facebook announcing my plan to drown myself in my aunt's creek. That post set off a chain reaction. The police got involved, and eventually, my grandmother stepped in and scheduled a doctor's appointment for me. I was put on antidepressants, and while they helped, they didn't change the way I felt about losing my grandpa. A few months later, I hit another low. I was lying in bed, crying uncontrollably, thinking about ending it by driving into a tree. The thought had been circling my mind for hours, and I was on the verge of making a decision. Then, in the middle of my breakdown, I suddenly felt a hand patting my back. It wasn't just my imagination. It was real. A steady, warm pressure, slow and rhythmic, like someone was trying to comfort me. I froze. I knew instantly who it was. Even through my tear-filled eyes, I saw him, a spectral apparition of my grandfather. He looked exactly the way I remembered him, standing there, watching over me. That morning, something changed. The suicidal thoughts that had consumed me for months were gone. It wasn't an instant fix. I still struggled with dark moments. But that encounter did something to me. It pulled me back. Later that year, on Christmas Eve of 2023, I was baptized in a Lutheran church. As I stood there, the pastor suddenly told me something that sent chills down my spine. He said that my grandfather's spirit was there, watching over me, witnessing my baptism before finally crossing over. I don't know what happens after we die, but I know this. My grandfather saved me that night. Maybe he had been waiting for me to find my way before moving on. Maybe he was always there, watching. Either way, I'm still here, and I think that's exactly what he wanted.